Let me just first of all welcome you all to the fourth iteration of the Search Mastery speaker series, where we explore the foundations and practice of search, skills, education, and literacy. And we're really happy today to have Anna Ndumu from the University of Maryland here to talk to us about search mastery as critical information literacy, and talk to us about what LIS, library information, adds to the conversation. So let me just mention that Anna is an assistant professor who researches and teaches on immigration information behavior and promoting racial representation within the library and information science field. Her work explores the cross between social identity and information access. Dr. Ndumu was a University of Maryland President's Postdoctoral Fellow, as well as a Council on Library and Information Resources Futures Fellow. Thank you, Anna. We're really looking forward to hearing from you today. And for the people who are listening, I just want to remind you that you're welcome to use the chat or the Q&A for questions. The chat does default to all panelists, so if you want to communicate with the entire group, just please select panelists and attendees, and that way everybody can see your questions and comments. So thank you, Anna. I'll turn it over to you, and we appreciate you being here today.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here, and I will now share my screen. Okay, can everyone see the screen okay? Awesome. So as Marianne mentioned, my name is Dr. Anna Ndumu, and I'm an assistant professor here at the iSchool. So today I'm going to be going over search mastery as critical information literacy. So today's talk is going to be all about search mastery and really the connection between search mastery and information literacy. So I'll be starting out by defining search mastery and then going into traditional library instruction. Then I'll go into how library instruction connects with reference and library practice. Then I'll talk a little bit about the ACRL information literacy standard, and then critical librarianship. I'll also critique library pedagogy, and then I'll conclude with a talk on how library pedagogy connects with critical LIS. So I am part of a research team, this is exciting, that is looking at search mastery and how we construct search mastery and how we train students to think about search mastery. So search mastery consists of knowing how search engines work, such as click restraint, and also tailoring searches and search terms. For example, narrowing, expanding, and refining searches, and also how to navigate and evaluate elements of search engine results pages. And finally, evaluating online content. So when it comes to search mastery, what we really think of is how are we conducting effective online searching and how are we evaluating search results? This is an essential aspect of information access. Typically, search mastery is taught within library instruction, especially when it comes to scholastic settings such as K-12 media specialists, and also academic librarian orientations and library bibliographic instruction. So this is where we typically understand search mastery, but this doesn't mean that public libraries are not a part of search mastery training. There's often workshops and trainings on everything from introduction to computer literacy to even how to apply for e-government services. So usually when we frame information literacy, instruction, and search mastery, it's usually couched within either bibliographic or technical research. But too often, this is very, very prescriptive, and rote and very rules-based. We typically focus almost entirely on how to navigate the library's suite of resources, especially scholarly databases. And we place tremendous emphasis on clicking, finding, applying information resources without really thinking about the totality of information and its role in everyday life. So we often talk about the different types of publications, the different types of works, but we never really scrutinize how those publications and those works are made. We often train students, and especially in academic settings, how to properly cite and credit works. And again, we're not really critically examining the production of those works and the quality of those works. And this is all a part of search mastery. So again, within library instruction, usually in reference and within especially college settings, when it comes to freshman orientation, those ENC 101 or those Gen Ed catch-all classes, there are three different types of models for library instruction. Usually there's an assignment-based model when it is pertaining to freshmen. And then within graduate education and even some of the higher level course training, you may have topics-based instruction and skills-based instruction. So these are very, very limited, and the purpose is typically very narrow. So what tends to happen is that you don't have enough time and enough bandwidth to really engage in deep discussions on how to use resources, how to search for resources, and how to optimize resources. So the structure of these instructional sessions are usually a one-shot or a 60-minute session. You may also have a multi-day or a series where people come back and they may be building upon the lesson and learning multiple skill sets. And you may also have credit-bearing courses where library instructors offer classes that are within the university system, and they are official and within the registry. And in community colleges, now they're becoming very popular. These may be 1 credit courses or up to 3 credit courses on bibliographic instruction, and sometimes to a lesser extent, information literacy. But over time, this very prescriptive and very practical and applied aspect of library instruction and search methodology has been critiqued for being too rudimentary, too basic, and not at all engaging with the socio-political aspects of searching. So within the library field and throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there became an awareness that we really needed to go a step beyond this emphasis on library resources and how to follow patterns of searching. So the information literacy movement came about in the 1990s. And very quickly, this grew steam and it became very popular, especially again in higher education. And this was at the same time of the critical thinking movement, which was an imperative within the Clinton and the first Bush administration. And even after that, the critical thinking movement was very prominent. And the skills that came to be associated with information literacy were media literacy, research and library skills, critical literacy, and information ethics. I would even add computer literacy to that. And this information literacy movement really became, a part of the banner of library and information science practice, and it became a branding mechanism as well. So in 2000, the Association for College and Research Libraries came up with 6 information literacy competencies. And these competencies were applied again throughout higher education, especially within campus libraries. Number one, the competencies are determine the extent of information needed, access the needed information effectively and efficiently. This is what an information literate person should be able to do or is expected to do, right? So number three, evaluate information and its sources critically. Number four, incorporate selected information into one's knowledge base. Number five, use information effectively to accomplish a specific purpose. Number six, understand the economic, legal, and social issues surrounding the use of information and access and use information ethically and legally. So these were the six ACRL competencies. And again, they were founded in 2000. And this began to reframe library instruction from those 60-minute one-shot assignment-based, extremely narrow kind of conceptualizations of searching. And it seemed to be effective for some time. The Information Literacy Project became a very big part of this information literacy movement. And in 2008, there was a seminal study that they conducted of over 11,000 college students. 7 out of 10 college students, it was found, they turned to Wikipedia for assignments. And as I tell my students, and for those of you who are here from my 602 Serving Information Needs class, you'll see that there's some overlap between this lecture and our information literacy lecture. And so, as I said in that lecture, this is not an indictment on Wikipedia. Wikipedia can be good for berry picking, according to Bates, or breadcrumbing. So it may have credible information embedded within it and cited at the end of it. So Wikipedia may be a great starting point for some, but according to the Information Literacy Project, 7 out of 10 college students began and ended their search with Wikipedia. And 92% of those college students also began their research with search engines as well. And only 46% of those students use library resources. Of those, 37% turned to e-journals, 30% turned to the library catalog, and 22% turned to ebooks, right? So this is a drastically smaller proportion of those who were turning to outside resources beyond the library's suite of resources. And 80% of college students did not at all ask a librarian for help, and 66% of them identified that defining a topic was the most difficult aspect of beginning their library search. And so there began to be pushback against information literacy because although there was tremendous mobilization and programming around information literacy, there didn't seem to be knowledge that was sticking or provoking or probing how knowledge is constructed. And even then, information literacy was still becoming all the more popular and making its way around other parts of the world. Here's a quote from the United Nations, UNESCO, and it says, information literacy empowers people in all walks of life to seek, evaluate, use, and create information effectively to achieve their personal, social, occupational, and educational goals. It is a basic human right in a digital world and promotes social inclusion in all nations. So you see that even though imperfect, information literacy began to be a mantra in other parts. And while information literacy started to become popular and ingrained in higher education, there was another movement that was growing, and that's the critical librarianship movement. And the CritLib movement argues that we really need to look at the labor practices, the ethics, the power, and the socio-political dynamics of information. And this is the key to helping people to really scrutinize resources and to scrutinize systems that provide resources. So a lot of literature was starting to be published through publishing vendors such as Library Juice Press, and we started to see a lot of conference themes around critical librarianship. The Journal of Critical Librarianship was born during this time. And as you see here through these book titles, CritLib ranged from anything from critical library pedagogy to critical information literacy, the politics and theory of practicing critical librarianship, toward critical inclusive assessment of library instruction, and even reference in librarianship as justice. And then the umbrella of CritLib started to become so popular that then you had subsidiary movements within it, such as critical information literacy, CritCat or critical cataloging, critical archives or CritArc, and critical reference or CritRef. And some of the thought leaders or people who have come to really define CritLib are Rory Litwin, who is the owner and publisher of Library Juice Press and Litwin Books, Eamon Tewa, who writes a lot about critical information literacy, Melissa Adler and Violet Fox, who discuss critical cataloging. For example, the movement to erase the Library of Congress subject heading illegal aliens, among so many other problematic subject headings. And then there's Emily Drabinski, who writes and talks about labor practices within LIS, such as using unpaid student labor and unpaid student internships being a part of LIS education. Emily also writes about feminism and how it intersects with the library and information science profession. And then there's also David James Hudson, who is a Canadian scholar, and he writes and discusses on topics dealing with whiteness and the construction of whiteness and mainstream society within LIS. Similarly, Amelia Gibson and Nicole Cook discuss critical race theory, which is another aspect of critical librarianship, and how race is, again, just like David James Hudson, constructed and embedded throughout LIS, and what are the topographies of whiteness in LIS. There's also Michelle Caswell, who looks at Indigenous studies and also critical archives and museum studies within the field writ large. And this is not to say that there wasn't a progressive or a countercultural sort of ethos within LIS until now. It is far from the case. We've always had very radical thinkers within LIS. Some of these thinkers include Kathleen de la Pena McCook, who has been the editor of the Progressive Library Journal, and she's been the leader of the Progressive Librarians Guild since the 1980s. We also have Sandy Berman, who was a radical cataloger, who was one of the first people to really call out racism and homophobia and Islamophobia within cataloging systems, especially the Dewey Decimal System, to say nothing of the Library of Congress system. And Sandy Berman is still alive and well in his 80s, still thinking and discussing all of these issues. And then there's E.J. Josie, who was one of the pioneers within Black librarianship. We have Hispanic thinkers who also helped with thinking about race and critical race within librarianship as well. So all of the people that I mentioned at first are following in the steps and in the legacy of a lot of people who were very, very forward thinking in what LIS could and should be. So when we talk about critical librarianship and critical LIS, what we're really asking, especially when it pertains to search mastery and information literacy, is how do we teach users to both optimize and scrutinize information? Not just do and not just point and click, but really probe and interrogate what information is, how it is packaged, and how it is delivered to us. And the Association for College and Research Libraries began to also kind of ask and question whether the competencies are enough. And so from that, in 2016, there was a radical shakeup and a real redefinition and reframing of what information literacy really is. And they stated that information literacy is an educational reform movement that will realize its potential only through a richer and more complex set of core ideas. So, how they redefined information literacy was by focusing on knowledge practice, or teaching students and users how to demonstrate an understanding of not just information literacy concepts, but dispositions to address the affective, attitudinal, and value and dimensions of information. So, as Bates would say, the invisible substrates of information, and getting people to look below the surface. So this is the new information literacy framework that was designed in 2016. It argues that information creation is a process, information has value, research is inquiry, scholarship is a conversation, searching is strategic, and authority is constructed and contextual. So we'll go through each of these one by one. So number one, authority is constructed and contextual. Oftentimes we train students to look for scholarly resources and just rotely or blindly cite, find 5 resources included in your article. Make sure you follow the formula for APA or MLA or Chicago style. Very robotic thinking, right? But we must also, in our information literacy courses, teach that information resources reflect their creators' expertise and credibility, and they should be evaluated based on information needs and context and how that information will be used. So authority can be including resources that are scientific and factual in a science or chemistry paper, or it could be deferring to a community thought leader or gatekeeper or opinion spokesperson if you are dealing with some sort of community manifestation of information or a community information need. So authority is localized, is constructed, is contextual, and it's really bound by what the information will be used for. And that determines expertise and credibility. So scholarly resources and library resources are not the only forms of authoritative information. And likewise, information creation is a process, and users need to understand the iterative processes of researching, creating, revising, and disseminating information and how this varies. So really what this has to do with is format. So an information resource is not credible because of how it is delivered. It's credible because of what went into creating that content, right? So a book is not credible because it's a book, and a website resource is not credible because it's simply online. So what makes a book or an online resource is how the research that went into it, or how it was prepared and packaged for the receiver, and how credible that information is, and what went into the process of disseminating it. So oftentimes students, and especially in higher education, we may blindly cite, and so you get cite bias as a result of this. We may blindly cite resources that are found within databases, but we may neglect resources that were perhaps self-published or found in some or other medium, such as a magazine. So there's this resource bias and this resource hierarchy that we inadvertently promote when we teach searching and information literacy. And then there's information as value. Information represents several dimensions of value, including commodity as a means of education, as a means of influence, as a means of negotiating and understanding the world. So information is power. And going back to authority, search engines and search systems are also powerful and a part of the entire political economy as well. So when we think about Google and Yahoo and Bing and so many other resources, we must also think about the corporations that drive them. And this will help us to negotiate and understand information resources. And research is also inquiry. Research is iterative as well, and it depends on asking increasingly complex and new questions whose answers in turn develop additional questions and lines of inquiry. So too often we train students to be users of research, but not contributors to research or even questioners of research. So we must again, train students to contribute to what is already known, to pick apart what is already known and give them agency and permission in that. So research is not flat, it's not defined, it is always, and it's supposed to be this way, it is always regurgitated. And scholarship is a conversation. So communities of scholars, researchers, and professionals engage in sustained discourse with new insights and discoveries occurring over time as a result of varied perspectives and interpretations. And this follows closely on the previous point. Scholarship is one big dialogue, it's a conversation. And we should be thinking about it as that, not as a fixed phenomenon, but as something that, again, can be and should be picked apart. So when we defer to scholars and research, we should not have a very, I suppose, fixed mentality. We should be training students to interrogate as much as possible. And lastly, searching is a strategic exploration. Following on the two previous points, searching is often nonlinear. We learn this when we think about berry picking and breadcrumbing and forward chaining, backward chaining. You may be recycling the same methods, going back to your original search, revising that original search, expanding that search. And this mental flexibility is very important, not just for searching, but also for scrutinizing and evaluating resources. So the entire search process is a way of creating new understanding and developing mental fortitude throughout. And so the information literacy competencies have changed over time. As I mentioned, what began as very prescriptive and rules-based thinking has now evolved into abstract and philosophies of information literacy. So the information literacy framework is a way to get us to move beyond how to act and the behaviorist aspects of searching into the more cognitive aspects, how to think about information, how to be an information actor or player, how to contribute to the information society, and how to scrutinize the information society. And this is all an important part of search mastery. And so I don't pretend to have all the answers. And this is a great way to get the discussion going today. Some of the things that I've been thinking about, and I'm very new to the Search Mastery team, but some of the things that kind of preoccupy my time are: how do search systems contribute to classism, capitalism, and paternalism? How does search mastery connect with ethics and equality? And what are alternate viewpoints or counter narratives on search mastery? These are things that we should be teaching students to think about, and students, when they become information professionals and knowledge workers, should be training their communities to think about. So beyond computer literacy, beyond digital literacy, how can we get people to simply question searching? And specifically for LIS professors rather, or LIS educators, we should be thinking about how we can train students to question the production and corporatization of information. Big business is a part of search mastery and it's here to stay. We need to bring that sort of implied aspect to the forefront and make it very, very explicit that we're working with big business when we work with search engines. And are we challenging students to think about how information systems frame power and authority? So how do we go away from the assignment base to more dialogic and didactic training of our students who are thinking about and using search engines? And what are the socio-political outcomes of how we promote information literacy and search mastery? And I would submit that all of these questions come about by, really engaging critical information literacy and engaging with the literature on CritCat and CritRef and CritIll. So these are the types of things that have been challenging me to think about how I train students in 602 and INST 610, the ethics class, and what my responsibility is as an educator. So I'll stop here. And again, these are some questions for just provoking discussion and thinking. And here's my information. Thank you for your patience today. Didn't expect at all of these tech issues, and it threw me off a little bit, but hopefully you were able to gain something from my discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. If there weren't technical problems, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting, so don't worry about that. We have lots of time for questions. So what we're going to do is, if you could, whoops, somebody put it in Q&A, just so I can't find it. If you could use the chat, what I will do is, if you ask, here's the secret, which is if you ask short questions, then I will repeat them. If you ask a long, complicated question, I will give you the ability to talk, and then you can ask the question. So Mega, I've just given you the ability to talk, so why don't you ask your question?
Okay, can you guys hear me?
No power structure here, sorry. Okay.
Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So Anna, thank you so much for this really wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it, so thank you so much. So Anna, with the advance of technologies, like bots and things that are, tweeting, and you see things that are floating around that real humans don't produce, those type of information, it really makes misinformation harder to detect, even for people who are well educated, right? So I am actually less convinced about the applicability of teaching based on frameworks. What I've been seeing is that through my own work, people are going for resources that friends and families recommend, or their Facebook circle recommends, right? So how can library instruction, I'm looking at all types of librarians, school, public and academic librarians, how can our search instruction be more dynamic, sort of be more individualized, and also based on the funds of knowledge that's more accessible to those individuals? And when I say funds of knowledge, I'm drawing from this framework that is very popular in science learning, which is like you basically learn from all the resources around you, from families, friends of family friends, your own friends, your networks, and all that. So a question for you. That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's such a good question, Mega. Thank you so much. for posing it. And it goes back to the issue of authority. And this is where the classism and the paternalism comes in, because we defer to certain things as credible and certain aspects of information as definitive. And usually that really reflects dominant society, dominant white, upper middle class, typically male society. So that is where we find a lot of typecasting in how we frame search mastery, information literacy, but also how we frame informed citizenship. And if we think about Elfrida Chapman's information poverty and life in around ideas, people oftentimes are self-protective, and that's what I hear in your question. Some people are, because of misinformation, just eschewing anything that is quote unquote the man, and just deferring to their small circle or their community or their enclave, because it's a self-protective mechanism. So that is where you find, information marginalization, information bias within those groups also, because they may not be fully informed of the larger society. But what it connects with is authority, and how people are, again, pushing back against what is authority, how they're constructing what authority means to them, what legitimate information means to them. In my own studies on immigration and immigrant communities, oftentimes there is a thought leader, there is a gatekeeper, there are communities, sometimes it's an elder, or it may be the women in a society for those societies that are maternal based. And so, and Laverne Gray actually does great work on Black feminist community leaders and how they became really information powerhouses within the Chicago public housing system. So I think for communities that are on the outskirts or the lower echelons of society, authority is a very loaded word and something that is very differently defined from what we mean by authority when we think about systems and information databases. So we need to allow people to define authority for themselves. So we, as information professionals, do not need to prescribe that or come with ready ideas of what information authority is or what credibility is, what value is in and of itself. Instead, we need to come and ask those questions, and from there, work with community members. You mentioned individually. One-on-one sessions are good in those instances. So those are very good questions. Some of the things that I'm still working through, again, I'm still a student in this area, but I really appreciate that question, Mega.
So Don, why don't you ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Anna, thanks for a great presentation. It's really wonderful and very thought-provoking. I thought you did a great job of talking about the rich opportunities that the ACRL framework provides. But I know that, based on my own research that I've been doing with Melissa Gross and Heidi Julian, where we've been talking to community college librarians, there are a number of practitioners in the field that think, particularly at that level, that think the framework is kind of elitist, that it's too abstract, it's too conceptual, that really most of the students they deal with need the skills first. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts on that.
First of all, Dr. Latham, I'm very, very honored that you're here. Dr. Latham taught the foundations class when I was in the PhD program, and his work has been very, very important to how we think about information literacy. And not only that, but you and Dr. Gross have looked at middle school, high school, college, so the progression and how people matriculate through education systems and are still left behind when it comes to information literacy. So thank you so much. And that is why I'm intimidated to ask this question or answer this question, because of the person who asked it. But Don, I think the elitism is, again, with, I'll use Eckhart Tolle's concept of vocational awe, where information professionals position themselves as those who know it all. And they, again, prescribe these ideas and these philosophies of information onto communities. So I can definitely see how the framework is construed as elitist, because how much, I guess, input did we get from community members? How much input did we get from students in framing the ACRL framework? And so I think, again, the classism, paternalism that people are pushing back against when it comes to how we create standards within LIS, it all points back to the fundamental problem that librarianship has oftentimes been seen as a space that is elitist and dominant within society.
Eric Hung has a follow-on question. So Eric, you can now talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. My question is, I mean, so these community information networks are often very, very important, right? So what are the roles of librarians in dealing with these information networks? Should we be more proactive with some of the information leaders in some of these networks? I don't know. I mean, it's not a fully formed question, but I think it's important to, like, if we're trying to convince anybody, we have to deal with these networks, but I'm not sure how to do so. But I also don't think we should be breaking down these networks necessarily.
I think we need to be better listeners. And this is piggybacking off my previous answer. I think we need to be much better listeners. We are an applied field, and too often we are pressured to do and act, and some of our services can be very knee-jerk. And I think we need to, part of critical information literacy is doing a better job of pausing and showing restraint. Just like search mastery and click restraint, we need some of that same restraint and discipline in order to do a lot more listening and understanding. And this is where social science theory is so important. Critical race theory and indigenous theory and so many other ways of knowing can help us as library professionals to be a lot more strategic in our thinking. And when we're strategic in our thinking, I think our partnerships will follow suit. Our community engagement will be a lot more relevant and effective. Some of the narrow thinking that I encounter a lot is just the blanket technologically deterministic attitude that immigrants are information poor. Who says that and why? Why do we hold that position and begin our information services with that position? It's a very problematic position. So Eric, to your question, I think part of, and again, I'm not just championing critical information literacy, because like so many other things, it's being co-opted. And there's a lot of follow fashion kind of rhetoric within critical information literacy. It began as a small avant-garde niche kind of philosophical wave. And now it has grown and exploded to the point that it's been adopted everywhere and sometimes misappropriated in some spaces. So again, we need to critique even critical information literacy, Eric. So what I'll say is that a part of critical information literacy that I admire is that we should be a lot more thoughtful and reflective in our information practices. And that starts with librarians asking great questions before they form partnerships.
So I want to ask a question that actually kind of is a little more abstract, about kind of how you suggest people approach something. In your remarks, there were some times where you seem to be using what, for lack of a better term, I'll call an oppositional framing of optimization versus critique. You didn't use the word versus, but there's this idea of someone might see this as one or the other. And then there were other times with other concepts where you saw them, you seem to be describing them as, I'll say, complementary or two sides of the same coin or things like that. This seems like a place where that thinking about whether things are in opposition or whether they're actually related in nuanced ways might be really important. And again, I'll give one example from some of the discussions we've had about search mastery. When talking to public librarians about this, one of the things they said is, well, most of the time when this comes up is when a person walks up to the desk and they have a very specific question and they want a piece of information. That's how they frame it. So I'm not interested in a training program. So again, they see it as, well, there's that literacy and engagement, and then there's what I do when someone asks me a question, and they see those as opposition. Do you have thoughts on how folks should approach this? So should they be looking for things that seem to be in opposition? Should they, question that? Should they run with that? Thoughts on that in this space?
I think rather than one approach or the other, I think what we should develop is just a questioning posture. And it's important for not only search mastery, but then also how we contribute to the information professions and the information society. So that questioning posture is probably the only takeaway I want to emphasize today, because again, there's things that are great and things that are very weak about critical information literacy, about search mastery, about search engines, about databases. The newest headline this morning, for example, is that LexisNexis is now going to be handling information management and information organization for ICE. So what does that mean for those who vehemently oppose the practices of ICE, but work in a law library, right? Do we throw away the baby with the bathwater? Do we say, I will never use LexisNexis again? What kind of reference services will you offer if you never use LexisNexis, right? So as we are in protest, as we are thinking about ethics and equality, we should just always maintain an awareness of the systems that are informing our practice, our searching, and how we train students and how we train library users on applying information access.
And I think that actually relates to a question that Sydney Triola asked a little while ago. How do you think we go about community healing in regards to a history of library spaces discrediting marginalized voices? I hear what you're saying as being part of an answer to that question. Do you have anything else you would add to that?
Oh, that's a big question. Probably bigger than I have time to answer. And it's another thing that really keeps me thinking. But what I love about the critical and the philosophical aspects, and there's a whole, I believe, I don't know if others would agree, but an ontological shift happening within LIS. And so community dialogues, there's a lot of frameworks. ALA has frameworks for hosting community dialogues in your library. We have trauma-informed librarianship, crisis-informed librarianship. Mega just taught a course on that. We have library neutrality being a deep and fervent discussion now. So I think there is a lot of promise. I'm an optimist when it comes to seeing better discussions and better solutions for not being community healers. I think that's too big of responsibility for libraries, but at least spaces where people can connect. So maybe police officers can have a town hall with some community members. A library may be a very promising space depending on the region to maybe host that, right? So we can be intermediaries, but maybe not the only people finding solutions to these problems. So that questioning posture can also help us with having the necessary conversations to see some of these things improve.
Mhm. Clara Chu had a question about some terminology, the terminology we use. And Clara, I gave you the ability to talk, so why don't you ask your question?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. I think you're bringing up excellent points and a lot for us to think about. So my thought was, this concept of mastery and whether we might rename it or reconceptualize it as a practice instead. So it's something that is evolving and changing, and we can get better at it or we can rethink it. And so this so-called practice would, engage positionality, reflexivity, disposition, epistemology, this notion of how we kind of share an understanding because of imagined community, as stipulated by Benedict Anderson. So taking kind of context into account, because when we use, for example, criteria such as authority, we know that in conspiracy theory, they do use scientists, right? This scientist said this. And then as authority, we have parents who might say certain things, and then you end up believing certain things until you get other information. Or as authority, we have religious leaders that say specific things. So I just thought I would throw that out in terms of how we conceptualize what it is that we're teaching or wanting users to think about when they're engaging with information.
Very good point. And I'm new to the Search Mastery research team, but the term mastery, it strikes me as behaviorist. So I think that is a very valid point. We're getting, even in that terminology, search mastery, we're getting back to the behaviorist kind of template-based ideas of searching, and that typology of skills, right? Just skills-based instead of cognitive-based or attitudinal dimensions of searching. But I think what's important is just understanding information flows and the power behind information flows. So thank you for your comment, Clara. And I think maybe in the future, I don't know who this decision will fall on, maybe Brian, I'm punting it to you, but search mastery and the framing of that does suggest a lot. It does suggest sort of a behavior, right? And a set of skills.
Yep. And one of the things that we've had some discussions we have a weekly meeting, which is not intended to be closed, but it's for folks that really want to meet a lot about this. And one of the discussions we've been having is what is captured in the distinctive approach we're taking. One of the parts of that discussion has been, to what degree are we focusing on behaviors on purpose, not because the larger perspective is not important, but rather there's some indication that there's students that just aren't even learning the basic skills. So you have, we actually have some stories anecdotally of students that have had exposure to information literacy training, but when you ask them how to read a results set, a search result set, they don't know what it means. They don't know what the ordering is. They don't know how it relates to their query. So we have had some discussions about how to balance the important approach and cognitive and attitudinal things that you're talking about, but at the same time not lose the behaviors, because if at the end of the day you can't actually come up with keywords that work, that's a problem too.
Right.
There's a trade-off there. Again, now I'm back to the oppositional language. There is a discussion there. There is.
Well, perhaps a balance, Brian, would be starting with the attitudinal to get the behaviorist.
Yep.
I think we amplify the behaviorist too much. How to do, point and click, go here, library databases. Okay, credible means highly cited, high H index. That metric-driven attitude can really leave us with some really unintended bias, and so that's a part of search mastery as well.
So again, I want to keep everything on time, so just to respect everybody's time. Thank you very much for the discussion, for the thought-provoking presentation, for the really important things to think about and act on. And thank you everyone who attended for the conversation discussion. Apologies that we couldn't get to all of the questions. We're really looking forward to next year being able to do this face-to-face again and allow for more of an interactive back and forth discussion. So thank you very much.
And I'll just mention that,
Marianne?
first of all, thanking everybody for coming as well. And we'll have Jason Yip talking on a really relevant follow-up to this. He'll be talking about designing for youth invisible work in families and how children of immigrant parents use their language and digital literacy skills to search and broker online information. So that's May 10th, the same time. And we'll be sending out the announcement a little bit later closer to the date. So thank you very much.
And the recording of this session will be available on the Search Mastery Interest Group website or webpage, I guess, probably sometime this week. Just depends on how quickly we can get the process. So that'll be available as well. Thank you.